The emergency room of St. Jude's Memorial was usually a symphony of controlled chaos, a predictable rhythm of beeping monitors, squeaking gurney wheels, and the sharp hiss of oxygen tanks, but tonight, the rhythm had shattered into a violent dissonance of shouting and shattered glass. Trauma Room 4 was a jagged wound in the center of the department, surrounded by a widening perimeter of terrified staff and useless security guards. Inside the glass-walled bay, a man backed into the corner like a wounded apex predator, his white dress shirt soaked through with a map of spreading crimson, a jagged shard of a broken saline bottle gripped white-knuckled in his right hand. He was losing blood fast, the pallor of his skin turning a sickly gray under the harsh fluorescent lights, but his eyes were burning with a lucid, terrifying focus that kept 3 armed security officers frozen in the hallway. Dr. Eris, the chief resident, was red-faced and screaming commands that were being ignored, his authority dissolving against the raw, kinetic threat inside the room. "Taser him! Put him down before he bleeds out on my floor!" Eris yelled, his voice cracking with panic, but the man in the room swung the glass shard in a violent arc, a guttural warning ripping from his throat in a language none of them understood. Kemi stood at the nurse's station, her dark blue scrubs blending into the shadows of the alcove, watching the scene with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the frenetic energy around her. She was 28, but her eyes held the heavy, weary depth of someone who had seen humanity at its breaking point long before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital. She clocked the tactical reality instantly. The man wasn't psychotic. He was cornered. The security guards were posturing, hands hovering over their holsters, terrified of the lethal intent radiating from the bleeding man. Kemi saw what they didn't: the way he favored his left side, the defensive angle of his stance, the fact that he was checking the reflection in the glass for blind spots. He wasn't attacking, he was fortifying. "Stand down," Kemi said, her voice low but cutting through the noise like a scalpel. She moved past Dr. Eris, ignoring his sputtered protest. "Nurse, do not enter that room. That is a direct order," Eris barked, grabbing at her arm. Kemi shook him off without breaking stride, her gaze locked on the man in Trauma 4. "He's going into hypovolemic shock, doctor. If we tase him now, the cardiac stress will kill him. I'm going in." The silence that fell over the trauma bay as Kemi pushed open the sliding glass door was heavy enough to choke on. The air inside smelled of copper, rubbing alcohol, and aggressive, radiating fear. The man, whose name the intake forms listed only as a John Doe but whose bespoke suit whispered of high-level organized crime, whipped the glass shard toward her. "Get back," he rasped, his English heavily accented, his chest heaving with the effort to stay conscious. The blood was dripping steadily from a gunshot wound just above his hip, pooling on the linoleum. Kemi stopped 3 feet away, raising her empty hands slowly, palms open. She didn't look at the weapon. She looked directly into his eyes, which were dilated and frantic. She saw the tattoo then, peeking out from the blood-soaked collar of his shirt, a specific, stylized coil of a black serpent, the ink fading slightly at the edges, a mark she hadn't seen since her time working the unauthorized clinics in the sprawling port cities overseas. It was a brand of loyalty, a ghost story told in the underworld. "You're losing the fight, and it's not the enemy that's killing you," Kemi said softly, her voice steady. "It's gravity." "Let me stop the bleeding," the man sneered, his grip tightening. "No doctors. No police. They are already here." Kemi realized then that his paranoia wasn't madness. It was intelligence. He wasn't afraid of the treatment. He was afraid of being pinned down when the hunters arrived. The stalemate was absolute, and in seconds, the security team would rush him, likely killing him in the struggle. Kemi took a breath, reaching back into a locked drawer of her memory, pulling out a phrase she had learned in a basement triage center in Busan years ago, a shibboleth meant to identify safe harbor in a world of wolves. She took a half-step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that only he could hear. "The tiger does not hunt when the mountain burns," she said in flawless Korean. The effect was immediate and visceral. The man's eyes widened, the feral rage fracturing into confusion and sudden, desperate recognition. The glass shard wavered in his hand. It was a code, a specific, archaic phrase used by the inner circle of the old syndicates to signal a neutral party, a sanctuary. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching her face for the betrayal he expected, but finding only a calm, ironclad resolve. "Who are you?" he whispered back, his voice trembling. "I'm the one who keeps you alive until the fire goes out," Kemi replied, switching back to English, but keeping the cadence intimate, urgent. "Drop the glass. Give me your hand." The transition from standoff to surgery was a blur of motion that left the rest of the ER staff stunned. The man, whom she would later know as Junho, slumped forward, the adrenaline finally giving way to blood loss, and Kemi caught him, her small frame straining under his weight as she guided him onto the gurney. "I need a crash cart, 2 units of Oneg and a trauma tray now," she shouted, the command snapping the frozen staff back into action. As she cut away the ruined shirt, exposing the jagged entry wound, Junho's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man in his condition. His fingers were cold, but his grip was burning. "Do not log me in," he wheezed, his eyes rolling back but fighting to stay locked on hers. "The system is watching." Kemi paused, the sensor on her digital chart hovering over his wristband. She looked at the monitor. His pressure was tanking, 80/50. If she logged him into the central hospital network, his location would be flagged to every agency and precinct in the city. If he was right, if he was being hunted from the inside, a digital footprint was a death sentence. Kemi looked at Dr. Eris, who was currently distracted by a pile-up in the waiting room, then looked back at Junho. There was a vulnerability in his face now that stripped away the gangster exterior, leaving just a man terrified of dying alone in a sterile room. It was a look that triggered a fierce, protective instinct in her, something that went beyond her oath as a nurse. She dropped the scanner. "Off the books," she whispered, leaning close to his ear as she pressed a compression pad into the wound. "But you have to stay with me. You don't get to die." A flicker of a smile, grim and pained, touched his lips. "I am hard to kill," he murmured. The intimacy of the moment was sharp and sudden, her hands inside his open wound, his life entirely dependent on her discretion. As she worked, packing the wound and clamping the bleeder, the air between them charged with a strange, high-stakes electricity. This wasn't just patient and nurse anymore, they were co-conspirators. She could feel his eyes on her face, tracing her features as she worked, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "My name is Junho," he gasped out as the morphine drip began to take hold. "Kemi," she replied, not looking up as she sutured. "And you talk too much, Junho." The reprieve was short-lived. 20 minutes later, the atmosphere in the ER shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a change in pressure, a silence that rippled from the front desk inward. Kemi was cleaning her hands at the sink, watching Junho's steadying rhythm on the monitor, when she saw them through the blinds. 2 men in dark suits, moving with a predatory efficiency that mimicked law enforcement, but lacked the boredom of real cops. They bypassed the triage nurse, flashing badges that Kemi couldn't read from this distance, but she recognized the body language. They scanned the room not like they were looking for a person, but like they were clearing a sector. They were hunters. Cleaners, Kemi thought, the word cold in her mind. Junho had been right. She wiped her hands dry, her heart hammering against her ribs, and moved back to the bedside. Junho was awake, his instincts pulling him out of the sedation. He saw the tension in her shoulders before she even spoke. "They are here," he stated, not a question. 2 men. West entrance. "They're sweeping the bays," Kemi said, keeping her voice level while she unlocked the wheels of his gurney. "They don't look like they're here to take a statement." Junho tried to sit up, groaning as the fresh sutures pulled tight. "Leave me," he said, his voice hard. "If they find you helping me, they will burn this whole place down. Go." Kemi looked at him, really looked at him. He was a criminal, a man of violence, a figure who likely had a ledger of sins longer than her arm. But in this room, under her care, he was a human being who had trusted her with his life when he trusted no one else. And there was something else, a spark in the way he looked at her, a desperate gratitude that terrified her more than the men with guns. "I don't abandon my patients," Kemi said, grabbing a pair of surgical shears and sliding them into her pocket. "And I definitely don't let people get executed in my trauma room." She killed the lights in the bay, plunging them into semi-darkness. "We need to move. Now." They moved through the shadows of the service corridors, the hum of the hospital ventilation masking the sound of the gurney's wheels. Kemi navigated the labyrinth of the hospital with the ease of someone who practically lived there, guiding them toward the freight elevators used for biowaste and laundry. Junho lay still, one hand pressed over his bandaged side, the other gripping the metal rail of the bed, his eyes scanning the ceiling mirrors and blind corners. "You are very good at this," he whispered, pain lacing his voice. Too good for a nurse, Kemi didn't look back, her focus entirely on the hallway ahead. "I learned to triage in places where the hospitals were the first targets," she said tightly. "You learn to move fast, or you don't move at all." They reached the freight elevator, and Kemi hammered the call button, the wait feeling like an eternity. Suddenly, the PA system crackled to life. "Code Silver. Lockdown in effect. All personnel remain in your designated areas." The voice was calm, automated, and chilling. The hunters had triggered a lockdown to trap them in the kill box. The elevator dinged, a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet corridor. As the heavy doors slid open, Kemi pushed the gurney inside, but a heavy boot slammed into the gap, stopping the doors from closing. Kemi spun around, scalpel in hand, placing herself between the patient and the threat. One of the men from the lobby stood there, a suppressor already threaded onto his pistol, a polite, dead smile on his face. "Nurse," the man said smoothly, raising the weapon. "Step away from the asset. This doesn't concern you." Behind her, she heard Junho shift, the metallic click of a brake being released. He wasn't cowering. He was preparing to spring. "It concerns me," Kemi said, her voice shaking but her hand steady. "When you bring a gun into my house." She kicked the emergency stop, not on the elevator, but on the fire alarm panel next to it. The klaxon screamed to life, a deafening roar of strobing light and noise. The assassin flinched, distracted for a fraction of a second, and in that heartbeat, Kemi shoved the heavy crash cart she had dragged with them, slamming it into the man's chest with all her strength. He stumbled back, the gun firing wild into the ceiling, and the elevator doors groaned shut, sealing them in the metal box. They were alive, but now they were trapped in the shaft, with nowhere to go but down, into the dark underbelly of the building. The descent was agonizingly slow, the elevator groaning as it lowered them into the bowels of the hospital. The red emergency strobe pulsed against the steel walls, turning the small cabin into a strobe-lit cage of blood and metal. Kemi was on her knees beside the gurney before the doors even fully closed, her hands flying over Junho's abdomen. The collision with the cart had jarred him bad. Fresh, bright red blood was seeping through the hasty dressing, staining her gloved hands. "You tore the stitch," she hissed, her voice tight with frustration and fear. She pressed down hard, using her body weight to stem the flow. Junho didn't wince. He just watched her, his eyes glassy but fixated on her face with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "Better the stitch than your throat," he murmured, his hand coming up to weakly grip her forearm. His skin was burning up, the fever of massive trauma setting in faster than it should. "You saved me back there." "Why?" Kemi looked up, locking eyes with him. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving her trembling, but his grip was a tether. "Because I'm a nurse," she said, though the words felt insufficient for the violence she had just committed. "And because you looked like you were waiting for someone to finally be on your side." The elevator jolted to a halt at the sub-basement level, the morgue, the laundry, and the boiler rooms. The doors slid open onto a cavernous, dimly lit corridor that smelled of industrial bleach and damp concrete. Kemi pushed the gurney out, the wheels echoing loudly on the cement floor. This was the circulatory system of the building, a maze of steam pipes and linen carts where the public never went. "We need a car," Kemi whispered, scanning the signage. "The waste management dock is at the end of the east tunnel. Trucks come in at 4 a.m. That's 10 minutes from now. Junho tried to sit up, his movement ragged. They will know, he rasped. The men upstairs. They are professionals. They will cover the exits, he coughed, a wet, rattling sound. Leave me here. Hide yourself. If they find you with me, they won't hesitate. Kemi stopped the gurney, grabbing his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. The contact was electric, a sudden breach of professional distance that felt inevitable. Listen to me, Junho. I just assaulted a gunman and hijacked an elevator. I am already burned. The only way I survive this is if you survive this. We are leaving together. They moved deeper into the labyrinth, the temperature rising as they neared the boiler room. The air grew thick and humid, the hissing of the steam valves masking the sound of their movement. Kemi's mind was racing, calculating routes. She knew this basement better than the security team. She knew which doors jammed and which corridors were blind spots for the cameras. But she also knew that professionals didn't need maps. They needed lines of sight. Suddenly, Junho's hand tightened painfully on her wrist. Stop, he breathed. Kemi froze. At first, she heard nothing but the rhythmic clanking of the boilers. Then she heard it, the distinct, wet crunch of a boot on a cockroach, followed by the soft sweep of fabric against a wall. They were close. Not behind them, but ahead. They had flanked the basement. Kemi looked around frantically. To their left was a heavy steel door marked biohazard storage, authorized personnel only. It was their only option. She keyed the code into the pad, her fingers slipping on the blood, and shoved the gurney inside, the maglock engaging with a heavy thud just as a shadow detached itself from the darkness at the end of the hall. Inside the storage room, it was pitch black until the motion sensors triggered a low, amber safety light. The room was stacked with red plastic bins and yellow barrels. Kemi pushed the gurney behind a wall of stacked crates, sliding down to the floor beside Junho. They were huddled in the cramped space, knees touching, the smell of antiseptic and iron enveloping them. Junho's breathing was shallow, his energy fading. Kemi checked the wound again. The bleeding had slowed, but his pulse was thready. She pulled a saline bag from the crash cart she'd dragged in, rigging a makeshift gravity drip by hanging it on a shelving unit. Stay with me, she whispered, her hand resting on his chest to monitor the rise and fall. Don't you dare quit. Junho turned his head, his cheek resting against her hand. The gesture was incredibly intimate, stripping away the context of the chase. You speak the language of the old families, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The code you used. The tiger does not hunt when the mountain burns. My father used to say that. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers in the amber light. Who are you, Kemi? A nurse does not move like a soldier. I grew up in places where the lines between soldier and civilian were erased, Kemi answered softly, her thumb brushing the sweat from his temple. The moment suspended in time, the thread outside the door forgotten for a heartbeat. There was a magnetic pull between them, born of survival and something deeper, a recognition of shared scars. I learned that life is fragile, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. And that sometimes, you have to break the rules to keep the flame burning. Junho reached up, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, leaving a faint streak of his own blood on her skin like a war paint. You are dangerous, he murmured, a faint, appreciative smile touching his lips. If we live, I will owe you a debt that cannot be paid with money. Kemi leaned in closer, their foreheads almost touching. The air between them was thick with unsaid things, a tension that was terrified and tender all at once. If we live, she whispered back, you can tell me why you have a dragon on your chest and a target on your back. The moment shattered with the sound of the electronic lock beeping. Someone was overriding the code. Kemi's head snapped toward the door. The red light on the panel turned green. They're in, she breathed. Junho's eyes hardened instantly, the lover vanishing, the boss returning. He spotted a tray of surgical instruments on the crash cart Kemi had brought. He reached out, his hand shaking but his grip firm, and took a long, thin scalpel. Get behind me, he ordered, trying to push himself upright despite the agony. Kemi pushed him back down.
No.
You can't stand. She grabbed a canister of pressurized disinfectant spray from the shelf and a lighter she kept in her pocket for the smokers on the loading dock. It was a desperate, improvised weapon, but it was all she had. "Stay low," she commanded. The door swung open, and the silhouette of a man with a raised weapon filled the frame. He stepped in, his weapon light cutting through the amber gloom. "Clear left," a voice said into a radio. Kemi didn't wait. She screamed, a raw, distractionary sound, and hurled a heavy biohazard bin at the intruder. The man instinctively swung his weapon toward the motion, firing a suppressed shot that punched through the plastic. In that split second of realignment, Kemi triggered the lighter in front of the spray nozzle. A profound, roaring tongue of fire erupted across the small room, a makeshift flamethrower that engulfed the gunman's upper body. He shouted, flailing back into the hallway, blinding his partner behind him. "Move!" Kemi yelled, grabbing the gurney. But Junho was already moving. Adrenaline had flooded his system, overriding the shock. He rolled off the gurney, landing on his feet with a groan of exertion. He grabbed the dropped pistol from the floor where the burning man had fallen, his movements fluid despite his injury. He fired 2 shots, controlled, precise double taps into the darkness of the corridor, suppressing the second shooter. "Go!" he roared, grabbing Kemi's hand with his free one, pulling her toward the rear exit of the room that led to the loading dock. They burst out into the cool, damp night air of the ambulance bay. The rain was falling in heavy sheets, washing away the smell of smoke and fear. The sudden drop in temperature made Kemi shiver, her scrubs soaked instantly. They were out, but they were exposed. A black sedan screeched around the corner, tires smoking on the wet pavement. Kemi flinched, pulling Junho back, but he held his ground. "It's mine," he said, breathless, leaning heavily against the concrete wall. The window rolled down, revealing a driver with the same snake tattoo on his neck. The cavalry had arrived, but too late to save them inside, only just in time to extract them. Junho turned to Kemi, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. He looked at the open door of the car, then back at her. The sound of sirens was rising in the distance. Police, fire, the real authorities. He couldn't be here when they arrived, and she couldn't be seen getting into that car. "You have to stay," Junho said, the realization paining him more than the gunshot wound. "If you come with me, you never come back. You become a ghost." Kemi looked at the car, then at the hospital where her life, her career, her identity lived. Then she looked at him. The connection was still there, burning brighter in the rain. She stepped closer, grabbing the lapels of his ruined shirt. "You're bleeding through the packing," she said, her voice choking up. "You need surgery." Junho shook his head, a sad smile on his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a heavy, silver ring with the family crest, stained with his blood. He pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers over it. "I have doctors who don't ask questions. But I don't have this." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for 1 second, a promise of intimacy that defied the chaos around them. "This isn't over, Kemi. When the mountain is cold, I will find you." He pulled away, sliding into the back seat of the sedan. The door slammed shut, severing the connection. The car sped off into the rainy night, taillights dissolving into the mist. Kemi stood alone in the ambulance bay, the rain mixing with the blood on her hands. The sirens were deafening now, blue and red lights bouncing off the wet pavement, sweeping over her. She looked down at her hand. The silver ring was cold and heavy against her skin. She clenched her fist tight around it, hiding it as the first police cruiser skidded to a halt in front of her. Dr. Eris ran out from the ER entrance, spotting her. "Kemi, my God, are you okay? What happened? Where is the patient?" Kemi took a deep breath, slipping the ring into her pocket, her face shifting into a mask of professional shock. She looked at the empty space where the car had been, then back at the doctor. "He overpowered me," she lied, her voice steady and convincing. "He ran into the dark. I couldn't stop him." But as she walked back toward the lights of the hospital, her hand stayed in her pocket, her thumb tracing the engraved serpent on the metal, knowing that the tiger would return.